Bien, pues muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a esta sesión, tercera sesión dedicada a los modelos y las
experiencias prácticas para la integración. Esta mesa pues justamente se plantea unas preguntas que son cuáles son los distintos grados o modelos de integración de los migrantes, qué relación hay justamente entre el marco legal y el tejido social, cómo se construyen instituciones y asociaciones. Y bueno, la idea es justamente que veamos ejemplos locales y poder, digamos, observar cuáles son los casos de éxito o también las lecciones aprendidas, cosas que tendríamos que mirar más de cerca para no repetir ciertos errores. En esta mesa nos acompaña Jonas Alwall, que es profesor en Migración Internacional y Relaciones Étnicas en el Departamento de Estudios Urbanos de la Universidad de Malmö en Suecia, y su investigación se centra en la diversidad cultural y religiosa en entornos urbanos, cohesión social y también en el papel de la cultura en el desarrollo sostenible. Es doctor en teología y en sociología de la religión. También nos acompaña Corinne Torrekens, que es investigadora en el grupo de investigación sobre las relaciones étnicas, migraciones e igualdad, GERM,
Aurora Torres in charge of equality from the, Corinne Torrekens from the Université Libre de Bruxelles.
También en esta universidad obtuvo su doctorado en ciencias
She obtained her
sociales y
PhD in this
políticas.
university in political and social
análisis de políticas públicas y durante 10 años
sciences.
también analizó
He has also, for 10 years, researched on the political impact of the insertion of Islam in the Belgian society. She has also worked on political participation of Muslims in Belgium, and since 2013 she has also worked on Islamophobia. She is also part of Diversity, also part of the Université Libre de Bruxelles, a project on social and political sciences, and a consultancy work on diversity. Unfortunately, Jordi Moreras, who should also be a member of this panel in order to provide information on the Spanish situation, has not been able to attend due to some health issues, and we would like to apologize on his behalf. I'm going to now speak in English so that I can introduce the presentation of the speakers.
Briefly, a brief welcome for all of you. My name is Karim Hauser, and I'm a part of this institution, Casa Árabe. I'm very happy to be amongst you this afternoon, and very happy that most of you could make it. I've heard that the morning sessions were very interesting, and what we'd like to hear is not only from the speakers, but also, of course, to hear from the attendants, to hear you participate and ask questions. Muslims in the member states of the European Union experience various levels of discrimination and marginalization in employment, education, and housing, and also the victims of negative stereotyping by majority populations and the media. In addition, they are vulnerable to manifestations of prejudice and hatred in the form of anything from verbal threats through to physical attacks on people and poverty. Discrimination against Muslims can be attributed to Islamophobic attitudes as much as to racist and xenophobic resentment, as these elements are in many cases inextricably intertwined. There is also yet given the situation, the true extent and nature of discrimination and incidents against Muslim communities remains severely underreported and underdocumented in the EU. There is a serious lack of data or official information on the social situation of Muslims in member states, and also on the extent and nature of Islamophobic incidents.
nonetheless, this seminar has different objectives, not only to insist on this lack of data, but also to try and encourage the debate and rely on the people who are mostly doing research and are in contact with these communities. I will not extend myself because this is precisely why we have invited people from across the European Union, and both of our speakers, Jonas, Alwall, and Corinne Torrekens, have a lot of experience, as I've mentioned in my introduction, in Spanish, and therefore I will just pass the floor to Jonas first.
Thank you, Karim, for the introduction. I just opened my presentation here. Yes. And I would also like to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and Casa Árabe for inviting me to come here and speak of experiences from Sweden. You know, Sweden is a very exotic and very cold country far up in the north. So this is really interesting for me to be here and to share some experiences and, of course, to learn a lot about other countries' experiences. Let me begin by giving you a brief presentation of a sort of timeline of Sweden's Muslim history. Before the end of the Second World War, there were basically no Muslims in Sweden. I mean, there were singular individuals who had come over time, but there was no real Muslim presence in Sweden. The first establishment phase I refer to as that was between 1948 and around 1980. That was a time of labor migration to Sweden, and most Muslims coming to Sweden would come as labor migrants from countries like Turkey, Yugoslavia, individuals from other countries as well, but mainly those. There wasn't much room for their religious life at that time. Muslims would typically meet in basement localities or in private homes, gather there for prayer. It was only in the late 70s that the first purpose-built mosque was constructed in Sweden, and others followed in the 80s and 90s. So that's when we can begin to talk about a major establishment phase. The phase of migration had changed by then, so it was no longer labor migration. It was rather refugee migration and migration of next of kin. And the countries that saw large numbers of people coming to Sweden were Iran in the 80s, former Yugoslavia, of course, with the civil war in the 90s. Sorry, it should be Iraq in the 2000s, not Iran, and Syria more recently. And over time, also quite substantial groups from Somalia, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and so on. And today, you could say that there are Islamic institutions in most Swedish cities. Some are still in a very basic condition, like you still find basement mosques. But in most Swedish cities, there are buildings that have been converted into mosques that really look Islamic and feel Islamic in that sense. I will add additional timeline here, just to inform you of some important dates in recent Swedish history. Until around the 1950s, Sweden was a very religiously homogeneous country. It was as you know, a Protestant Christian country, had been for centuries. There was not much diversity at all. In 1951, Sweden had a Religious Liberty Act, or religious freedom was inscribed in the law. That was mainly what we would refer to as negative religious freedom. the right of people not to be religious or not to belong to any religious organization. In 1975, the Swedish government had realized that Sweden was now a pluralistic, culturally, religiously, etc., pluralistic society. So they formed a set of goals for the immigrant policy. That's what it was called in the 70s. And those goals declared Sweden to be a culturally pluralistic country, and it also opened up for the state to support financially and in other ways religious communities. In the 1990s, the immigrant policy was turned into an integration policy. So integration as a political and legal term is what you can find after the 1990s. The goals of the Swedish integration policy are equal rights, demands, and opportunities for everyone, regardless of ethnic and cultural background. And it's often added in an increasingly diverse society. So I think that this resembles what Muhammad Aziz was talking about in Britain before. In the year 2000, the Church of Sweden, the Lutheran Church, and the state were separated. That didn't mean much to the other religious organizations, but they can still earn public recognition and receive state funding, etc. But what has happened since the year 2000 is that of course, with growing migration, Sweden has become increasingly diverse. So, how many Muslims are there in Sweden? Well, the true answer is that no one knows. And we're not even allowed to ask that question. It's in the constitution in Sweden that no one can register a person's religion. So the only thing we can know is how many members there are in publicly recognized Muslim organizations. And that figure is around 140,000. But there have been many estimates as to the number of Muslims in Sweden, and I think most of them end up somewhere around between 450 and 600,000. So that would be a sort of truer figure of the number of Muslims. Of course, we can mean many things with Muslim. For some people it's a very strong religious identity, but it could also be a cultural identity and so on. So depending on what you mean, you could end up with different figures. But in Sweden, it should be clear that the Islamic presence is to a significant extent a consequence of migration. And these are figures as to the number of migrants or immigrants who have come from a number of countries. And it's among these countries where we can expect that the biggest groups of Muslims have come from. It's former Yugoslavia, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and so on. You can see figures here, but they are not figures of Muslims. They are figures of the total number of immigrants having come from those countries. All in all, Sweden has a population of 10 million. And 17% of them are immigrants. They were born in another country. An additional 6% would also include people who were not born outside Sweden, but whose parents were, both parents were. So of these people, the official term is that they have a foreign background. I want to say something about research I conducted now many years ago about integration of Muslims in Sweden. The question I was asking is what does it take for Muslims, Muslim groups, communities to become established in Sweden? Established is, in my mind, close to integrated, but it also carries a meaning of being recognized as a religious community in its own right. This research is quite old now, but I think it has been confirmed by later research several times, so I dare to say a little bit about it anyway. I was talking about internal criteria and external criteria. The internal is the kind of strength and resources that the group needs to have itself, an in-group solidarity, and infrastructure and resources that are strong enough to build a lasting institution. Those were the internal criteria. The external criteria have to do with how you relate to the surrounding society. And there an important factor, if you are to become established, is that you are visible, that people can see that you exist. And that's, you could say, is the difference between a basement mosque and a purpose-built mosque, because the purpose-built mosque is visible. It's visible in society. You also have to achieve a degree of Swedishness. And that could mean many things, of course, but for instance, it would mean that you communicate in Swedish. And you can see a huge difference there between Muslim organizations that communicate in Swedish, they have websites in Swedish, and others who primarily convey messages in Arabic, for example. Of course, it's the former who appear to be more established in the country. And then I think, or I thought that there was also need for what I called an institutional displacement. And that's a strange term, I'm not altogether pleased with it, but what I meant was that the religious, the group, the community would have to move away from the strictly religious and do other things as well, like forming women's groups or youth groups or having sports activities, etc. That would gain a recognition within the civil society of the country. And then finally, there are also formal means of becoming established. You can become registered as a faith community. You could gain public recognition that way. You could get state funding. You could get local municipal funding, etc. This points to a dilemma for some of these groups. And I phrased that dilemma as a dilemma between religiousness and mainstreamness. In Sweden, there is a secularized way to regard religion, which I call conspicuous is suspicious. If you're seen too much being religious, that's strange to many Swedish people. And in the eyes of the Muslim communities or other religious communities, to totally accept secular values is not really what you strive for. You want to preserve your religious identity. You want to gain freedom, and you want some measure of equality, so you can be equal with others in that society, in a pluralistic society. And you have the mainstream culture that wants you to move away, as I said, move away from the strictly religious. So here is a dilemma for many Muslim groups. Another dilemma, which is current and ongoing, I would say, has to do with the refugee immigration to Sweden. You can see from these pictures, one is from my hometown, Malmö, which I will say a little bit more later. And this picture shows what happened in the autumn of 2015. During that year, Sweden received 163,000 asylum seekers. And in relation to the country's population, that's a really high figure. And you can see down below that the year 2015 was really a peak when it came to asylum-seeking people arriving in Sweden. After that, regulations were changed. Sweden adapted to a more to the European standard when it came to decisions about asylum, and it also closed its borders or created border controls. So recent figures have been much lower, but of course there is a problem, a continuing problem with integrating these new groups, because most of them don't return. They stay in Sweden, and we don't know what will happen and how they will cope with their new country. I would like to describe it in this way. There is a force field surrounding Swedish Muslims, and it has five parts. There are 5 forces that I have identified. And these 5 forces are the secular society, its Islamophobic and xenophobic attitudes, its fundamentalist and extremist tendencies in society, its socioeconomic segregation and exclusion, and it's the Islamic institutions themselves, be they mosques or congregations or other types of institutions, cultural institutions, different groups, but also things like cemeteries, etc., that Muslims create as institutions. There is a strong risk, and many have perceived that there is a sort of barrier building up between what is considered to be Swedish society and what is considered to be Islam. But there are also several attempts made to bridge these barriers in order to create what is sometimes referred to as a blue and yellow Islam, a Swedish Islam. Blue and yellow, you know, is the colors of the Swedish flag. And this website that I'm showing in the background is an example of this. It's called islam.se, which is a Swedish domain. It doesn't show pictures of the Kaaba in Mecca or of other famous Muslim mosques, etc. It shows pictures from Sweden. It shows pictures of Stockholm City Hall and so on, just to sort of show that this is a platform for Swedish Muslims. So this is an example of what I would call blue and yellow Islam. It should be remembered, and now I'm talking about the relationship with secular society here. And these are data from the World Value Survey, which is conducted every 6 years, I think, that there is not a more secularized and individualistic country in the world than Sweden. So this is really, it becomes very clear if you see this picture that Sweden is an extreme country. I apologize for the amount of text here. I won't run through it, but I just want to make a few points. I would say, in spite of this extreme secularization in Sweden, things are not looking too bad when it comes to the relationship between Muslim communities and the secular society. And part of this is because of a lasting impact of the immigrant and integration policies that I mentioned. In the general political discourse, immigrant minorities are not seen as a threat, but rather as contributors or even partners in the formation of a pluralistic and democratic society. And secondly, in this process, the faith-based organizations play an important part, at least if they manage to collaborate with other parts of the civil society and with public authorities. And thirdly, this process is particularly likely to succeed in Muslim organizations that are already multi-ethnic, because these organizations already have to be open to different traditions, ideas, and outlooks. Then we move to Islamophobia in Sweden. And I have a picture here of the leader of the so-called Sweden Democrats Party, which is the most clearly xenophobic or Islamophobic party. And you can see one of their ads saying a multicultural Sweden, no thank you, showing a picture of a mosque to exemplify what they don't want. And the leader, Jimmy Åkesson, has actually stated that the Muslims are our greatest foreign threat. As a country, that is what threats us most. And he turns this sort of into both foreign policy and integration, a question of integration at the same time, saying that Muslims shouldn't be in Sweden at all. There are many aspects of Islamophobia in Sweden. You could say that some of these aspects are types of everyday xenophobia. They are present in societal structures, in the work life, in housing, in education, but also, of course, in attitudes of fear and antipathy among members of the majority population. But this political party, the Sweden Democrats, have been extremely successful in absorbing these fears and antipathies. So the voters of this party are really very likely to show such attitudes. What are the effects of Islamophobia? Well, there are numerous examples of hate crimes against against Muslim individuals and against Muslim communities. For example, arson attacks on mosques. Women who wear hijab are frequently exposed to Islamophobic attitudes from what appears to be ordinary Swedes in everyday situations. And there are examples of Muslims feeling they have to change their name in order to get a job, in order to achieve integration in society. And of course, that's not what intended when we talk about integration, but there are quite a few Muslims who feel they have to change their identity, at least the way people see them. The third thing I was going to talk about was radicalization and terrorism. There have been only few examples of terrorist acts in Sweden with Muslim perpetrators. These are the two main ones, which have caused casualties, both in central Stockholm, one in 2010, one in 2017. I think you may have heard about the last one, where 5 people were killed by a man driving a lorry through a crowded street. The Swedish government and the security services have tried to identify these threats, and they say they mainly come from returning fighters from Middle Eastern backgrounds and from individuals having been inspired and radicalized by extremist messages of different kinds. Such messages may be spread orally in group assemblies, small groups often, closed groups, or through websites and social media. We all recognize these phenomena. A bigger problem, perhaps, are the people who have left Sweden, young Muslims who have left Sweden to fight for ISIS in Syria and Iraq. There is a large number, the Swedish security services say. I don't know exactly, but it's probably in the hundreds. Of people who have done that, and some of them are returning, and that causes problems. What do you do with an ISIS fighter who returns to Sweden? Is he or she a threat? How can you treat them? They have committed crimes, etc. This is a big question in Sweden today. Muslims react, of course, try to say that extremism is not part of their idea of Islam. Although they recognize that some people maybe have an Islamic attitude, and that Islamic notions may actually be provoked here, but it doesn't have anything to do with Islam. If I can have a few more minutes, I would just to wrap it up and say a little bit about my hometown. This is my local example. My hometown is Malmö, which is in the very south of Sweden. We are on the sound between Sweden and Denmark. It's only 35 kilometers across a bridge to Copenhagen, the Danish capital. Malmö is a city that grows a lot. It's the most, at least in relation to its size, it's the most culturally, ethnically diverse city in the country. It's also the country with the biggest socioeconomic inequity in the country. It has the poorest, some of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. In Malmö, there is a strange mix, because on the one hand, you have a very convivial life. You see people of all different nationalities and creeds live together, work together. but you also have this very strong segregation when it comes to where people live. When I started to study Islam in Sweden, while Malmö was one of my cases, at that point there was only one major Islamic institution in Sweden. This was 20 years ago. Not in Sweden, in Malmö, sorry. And this was called the Islamic Center. That has expanded since then, but what has mostly happened is that there are several new Islamic institutions. And very soon there will be 3 purpose-built mosques in this city alone. I think Corinne will, what you will say can relate to this picture of Malmö. You can see the geographical concentration of these mosques, for example. I've been looking into 3 local examples of measures to integrate Muslims. I will just mention them briefly because my time is scarce, but one is called the Malmö Muslim Network. And it's a network of different Islamic organizations, and I think some of them are quite ethnically closed organizations, but by working together, by conveying a message to the surrounding society of and giving a positive image of Islam, they are actually managing to do what I talked about before, becoming a factor for integration. This group of organizations and of course people. There are significant people in these groups. They are what sometimes referred to as everyday makers, people who make things possible. And they have a strong commitment, not just for their religion, but also for their neighborhoods and for the integration of their groups. Then another example is about popular adult education. The name Ibn Rushd has been mentioned before today. He has also given name to this association, which works very closely with the surrounding civil society, but which primary goal is to teach Muslim adults things which have to do both with their own religion, with language, and with the kinds of skills that will integrate you in society. And the third example, which I think is quite exciting, is a collaboration that is done under the name of Open Skåne. Skåne is the name of the province where Malmö is. In English, it's called Scania. This is a collaboration that is between Muslim communities in this whole region and the regional police force. Police and Muslim leaders have been meeting each other, sharing experiences, talking and teaching each other, and this has caused much less fear, much less lack of knowledge between these groups. It only took a few months after their first meeting, and then most Islamic mosques in these cities had been visited by local police. So the Muslim people, members of these congregations, had met police, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, as their guests. And of course, the other way around. The police had attended Friday prayers. They knew people. Suddenly they had names, faces, phone numbers they could use whenever they wanted to find out something. For example, to help if someone, a young Muslim, was arrested, there would be people that they could talk to. And of course, I think this is fundamental if you want to conduct good police work, that you know the neighborhood, that you know the people. So this is a good example, I think, of integration. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas, for giving us also a sort of like a balanced talk between the forces and like an overview of also the immigration and how Muslims have arrived to Sweden, all the way up to this Swedish Islam, and concrete examples in your hometown. I think this is very, very useful when we try to think of ways or different institutions and how do they interact with the authorities, namely in this case with the police. And I think it's very telling that in different European countries, we will have different interactions with the police, also depending on how the police interacts with civil society. Yes. You know, there are police forces and police forces, for sure. I'll go straight to Corinne Torrekens so we can tackle Sweden as or Belgium as well, and then give some time to the debate. I just need to break the news that we won't have a coffee break, unfortunately, for those of you struggling with sleep, because at 7 p.m. we have cinema film at Casa Árabe, so we need to sort of like be a bit compact in the evening sessions. Entonces, muy brevemente, decirles que no va a haber pausa café, sino que haremos una pequeña pausa nada más para cambiar las mesas y las aguas, para poder pasar directamente a la sesión siguiente, dado que a las 7 hay cine en Casa Árabe y tenemos que ventilar un poco y limpiar un poco antes de que vengan la audiencia. So, please, Corinne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for this invitation. We just spoke about the yellow and blue identity, and so I'm making a link with this time the black, yellow, and red, which is the flag of Belgium, a Muslim identity. What about this identity in Belgium? Maybe firstly to give you some background information. Islam was recognized in 1974. The mass immigration in Belgium began in the 60s, so the bilateral agreements with Morocco and Turkey. So the main population are coming from Morocco and coming from Turkey, dates back from 64. So we have 7 religions, but also non-confessional worships, for example, such as laïcité. I know it's always strange to explain to French people, for example, that laïcité in Belgium is a non-confessional worship, which is recognized and organized and financially supported by the Belgian authorities. But also Buddhism, for example. Buddhism is on its way to be recognized in Belgium. However, we have an ongoing debate about the place of Islam in the Belgian society, especially regarding the visible practices. I give you some examples, only the main example of this debate. So since 1989, we have an ongoing debate about the veil in schools, but also in higher education institutions, in job markets. In 2012, the Constitutional Court forbid the wearing of the face veil. In 2016, we had the Burkini affair, but you know the weather in Belgium, and we have less beaches, so it was not so long, but we had a couple of weeks during the summer 16, we had a Burkini affair. And then in this year, Belgium just decided to forbid the halal slaughtering, so both for the Muslim and Jewish communities. So halal slaughtering will not be permitted anymore in 2019, and we have a debate regarding all this radicalization and terrorism stuff about the presence of this is a picture of the Great Mosque of Brussels, which is one of the larger mosques in Belgium, which is a Salafi one, linked to Saudi Arabia and to the place of Salafism in Belgium. In these debates, foreigners, so Moroccan citizens, Turkish citizens, they became more and more immigrants, and nationality was no more the limit or the barrier to make a difference, but the origin was the new limit. But in these debates that I just show you, the term used is really Muslims. And I really do consider that being Muslim or non-Muslim is really the new border of ethnicity in Belgium. We've decided, is it possible to be both Belgian and a visible and a practicing Muslim? We have also an increasing political and media coverage of this question, maybe kind of sur or over visibility. I just show you some examples of press covers that are quite explicit. I don't need to translate it. So, for example, one is saying how Islam is threatening school. Do you eat halal without knowing it? Brussels will be Muslim in 2030. So you see a bit the kind of hysteria and fear in these, some example of press covers. And of course, we had the terrorist attacks in March 2016 in the airport and in the metro, linked to a debate about radicalization and terrorism. What we have also in Belgium is an increasing due to the terrorist attacks that they have increased this, but it was already present, a huge polarization that we can define as a mutual distrust, misunderstanding, and social distance. And this is the sense of this cartoon. You see an extreme right militant saying thank you, gracias, to a militant of Daesh, because these two kinds of groups are reinforcing each other. To give you the example, the very concrete example, just after the attacks of March 2016, citizens were gathering on a place in Brussels called the Bourse, La Bourse. That was a place of remembrance in a certain sense. And a few days after the attacks, a group of 400 extremists, extreme right militants arrived in the Bourse and made a demonstration there. A few months later, we had a survey showing that many Belgians, so with no foreign background, so really the white, non-foreign origin Belgian, consider that there is too much immigrants in the society. They are 67% to consider that there are too much immigrants in the society, and 66% to think that we as white Belgian, non having a foreign background, we are invaded. On the same line, there are 74% to consider that Islam is not a tolerant religion. This is highly more than other religion. And the presence of the Muslim community is considered as a threat for 60% of the population. For all these results, the older you are, the more you share these ideas, and the more you are less educated, the more also you share these ideas. On the other side, this time on the side of the Muslim group, which was also in the survey, 400 Muslims were integrated in this survey. 33% of them said, "I don't like the culture or the Occidental way of life." And what made a lot of debates in Belgium, 9% of them said, I do not firmly condemn the terrorist attacks. I do not. 9% of them do not firmly condemn the attacks. So this is only to give you a bit the picture of the polarization in Belgium. One point, one element of this polarization is maybe that many Belgians, as other European, overrepresented the size of the Muslim population. And this is the sense of this picture. For example, in France, the majority of the French people that Ipsos, the survey institute, interrogated, they say there are 40% of Muslims in France. The reality is 8%. Okay, it's the same in Belgium. So the majority of the person respond there are 30% of Muslims in Belgium, and the reality is, as you said, for Sweden, between 5 and 7%. So there is a huge gap between the representation of the size of the Muslim population and the reality of this presence. Maybe this is one element of this polarization. And in this debate, what we often hear is the idea that integration is a failure. We had a lot of politicians who declared that during the last months or weeks. What I would like to explain you is a couple of elements that we found in a survey based on the Belgo-Moroccan community and the Belgo-Turkish community. Both are forming more or less 90% of the Muslim Belgian communities. And to show that the integration, what we call integration, is a very nuanced picture. So things are going well or going better, and other things are still an issue. And I'm going to base myself on this study, so also a statistical damned study or survey. I don't have the time to show you all the tables, so I summarize, and I'm going just to explain some of the main elements of this study. What is going better, or what has changed? Because saying that what is going better is really normative. What we observe is a progressive secularization of the Muslim Belgian identities. What I mean is that we tested all the religious practice. Do you pray? Do you go to the mosque? How often do you go to the mosque? Do you eat halal? Do you respect Ramadan? And so on, and so on, and so on. So we tested all the religious practices. All these religious practices, each religious practice is highly followed. But what we observe also is an increasing individualization of faith and a kind of bricolage. I don't have a word in English for that. Bricolage, which is really... It's used in English too, okay. An increasing bricolage of practices. What does that mean? We observe that there is two kinds of transmission. One is collective. It's done by parents, quite classical, and also by groups of peers, friends, for example, but also one kind of transmission is done by lectures. I read some authors. I go and check some references. This is really something that is really individual. This is one dimension. What we observe is a low impact of imams and predicators on the construction of faith. What is important for the construction of your faith? Parents, friends, readings, and so on, but really not often imams and predicators. And then we try to put all these religious practices in the same statistical model, and it does not work. What does that mean? Well, we have persons that they pray every day and they respect the 5 prayers a day, but they don't do Ramadan. Some do Ramadan, but they don't go to the mosque. Or they pray, but they drink alcohol, and so on and so on. This is this very idea of bricolage and individualization of faith. I have my own interpretation of religion, of religious tradition, of religious duties, and I am responsible in front of God of this relationship, okay? One dimension, what we observe, I just told you that in Belgium we have an intense debate about the place of Islam, radicalization, Salafism, fundamentalism, and so on. What we observe in our statistical data is that being more religious, those who pray, respect all the prayers, and respect Ramadan, those who are the more religious, there is no impact on what we call integration. They are not less active on the job market. They are not less democratic. They are not less politically active, and so on. So they do not differ very much in values or in activity. So religion in our data has no impact on integration. This individualization, what I just explained, and the weak impact of mosque as an institution, and I'm not saying that mosque is not important for recognition, for ritualization of faith, for gathering and so on. This is not what I'm saying, but as an institution, it seems that it has a weak impact on the construction of faith. These two indicators, it's the beginning of secularization. That's one point. Second element of what is going better is democratic values. Democratic and political values, they are acquired. At least 60–70% of the person we asked said democracy is the best form of government. Same for church and state. Do you agree that church and state must be separated? Yes. Agree on freedom of speech. 70% of them disagree with the idea that a university cursus is better for boys than girls. 80% agree on the idea that domestic tasks have to be equally shared between the father and the mother. So democratic values is not an issue anymore. What we observe also is that there is an increase and a better economic status. We found that a bit less than 40% of the Belgo-Moroccan group, they have a higher education degree. This means that it is the same and a bit better than the entire Belgian population. It is a bit less in the Belgo-Turkish group. And same, the revenues, they also have increased. We have socioeconomic categories that were absent in the other survey exercises that we had. Same in the languages, a majority of respondents declared to at least often use French and Dutch with children. This is also, so language is used inside the families. Identity, at least 50% of the respondents consider that they are as Moroccan Turkish than Belgian. So having this both identity. But there are also issues, of course, and problems that are at stake. For example, the level of intermarriages. At least 80% of Belgo-Moroccans and Belgo-Turks of the survey are married or in a relation with someone having the same origin or nationality, so being Moroccan or Turkish. And this must be put in relation with another result of the survey, 40% of them disagree with the idea to marry with a non-Muslim person. What we observe also, which is more striking, we observe a generation effect. This means that the second and third generation, which is born, educated, socialized in Belgium, this second and third generation feel more different than the Belgian without a foreign background. This is what we call the social distance. So they consider themselves more different. And this is not the case in the third generation of migrants. So this gap is growing, and they are Belgian. And so they feel they consider themselves as more different, and they are less active in the job market, less interested in politics, etc. So one way to maybe explain this is the theory of a reactive ethnicity. It's quite simple to understand. In a country where there is a growing hostility and racism and xenophobia, there is a reflex to more identify to your group of origin. So this is maybe one explanation, but I just told you that in the survey we observed that a majority of the person, they consider that they are as Moroccan Turkish than Belgian. So in our data, we don't see this track of reactive ethnicity. What we observe also, so I just tell you that the democratic values, it's okay, it's acquired. But there is a social conservatism. So there is a strong opposition to homosexuality, euthanasia, abortion, sexuality before marriages. So all these issues linked to sexuality and to ethics, there is still a kind of opposition. And then we have also the presence of Orthodox groups opposing these trends of individualization and secularization, saying that Islam, it's a kind of, I always use this expression of package, take it or leave it. So you have to respect the 5 pillars, you have to respect the five prayers, and so again, all these question and this trend of bricolage. So we have these Orthodox groups, and it is quite complicated for a neutral country, a neutral state, to answer to the presence of this group, because there is the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, and the difficulties to engage in, for example, one idea is to translate the liberal theological books that exist or thoughts to support Muslim intellectuals without being accused of interventionism and to adopt quite paternalist views. Quickly, yes, I finished. I'm on my conclusion. To conclude, I would like to say a word on the term integration, but it was already said this morning. We have to consider that in Belgium we speak of the 3rd and 4th generations. So having the Belgian nationality, I mean, they are Belgian. They are Belgian citizens. So to what they have to integrate. So this is really something that we have to think, because we have to think about the effects of the discourses that are produced in political debates, in media spaces, but also the categories that we produce as analysts, as intellectuals, as citizens, when we speak of the others. And I think that we have to think about the consequences of this discourse, of the terms that we use, and stop thinking that there is no consequences on the construction of identities. And again, I come back to these ideas of reactive ethnicity, reactive religiosity, and the effect on all the radicalization, for example, process. So instead of speaking of integration, I prefer speaking of dynamics of participation and inclusion on job market, for example, where we know that there is still a gap of 20 to 30% depending on your origin. So if you have a Turkish background, if you have a Moroccan background, you have between 20 and 30 less chance to get a job, no matter of the education you have. So this is still an issue in Belgium. And in this frame, integration is a mutual process, an interaction implying two sides, a group and a society, a majority and a minority. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Corinne, for giving us also this overview of the issues in Belgium. I think it's very difficult to measure identities. I think it's a very complex process, and despite the fact that you have statistics, and as you say, it's very people choose to identify as a Belgian or a Belgo, Turkish, Belgo, Moroccan. The hyphen, that hyphen sometimes is shorter than others, and this combination of identities. Then on top of that, you may be more Flemish than Wallon. On top of that, what type of Belgo is that side. So it's I think it's very very complicated, but I think that you have managed to give us a very nuanced also perception of what are the issues, the role that media plays, the role also that Jonas mentioned of political parties. I think this is something that we need to take more seriously, how, of course, there are political parties that are extremely xenophobic and like right-wing or extreme right type of parties, but what are the counterparts of those parties? What do they actually do to promote political participation or integration in a different way? But other than that, I think the individualization that you mentioned of faith and this bricolage is very interesting, because it allows us also to really perceive or understand much better that not everybody feels that Islam is such a package, that it comes in different, just as Christians or Protestants or Buddhists are very diverse, so are Muslims, not only in their home countries, but of course in the European Union, which is what we're talking about today. So I will open the floor for to your questions. Si por favor queréis hacer